Hey folks, you are tuning into Common Groundwater, a podcast by the Michigan Environmental Council, where we talk about environmental issues that are across the state. We dive deep into the issues and we bring up the solutions that are available for them. I'm joined today by Megan Tinsley, a coworker of mine at the Environmental Council. She's the Water Policy Director. And we're here today to talk about water pollution and some of the ways in which our state has been a bit limited in being able to properly protect us from it at no fault of its own. So, Megan, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And you are part of the first episode of a mini-series within this podcast called The Polluter Rulebook, which is going to tell a little bit of a story arc over the course of a few episodes about the state of pollution in Michigan and how we can kind of take the red pen to some laws, to some acts, and be better able to protect Michiganders' wildlife, water from those pollutants. So to those tuning in, welcome to the new series. And if you haven't checked out our last series, you can go back in the episode list to watch Project Greenprint, which is a story series about the intersection between affordable homes and sustainable homes. So, Megan, before we kick off today, I'd like to start off with nice little icebreakers.
Okay.
And since you're our water policy director, we're talking water.
Yeah.
Gotta ask, do you have a favorite Great Lake? And if so, what's your case for your favorite?
Okay. Well, I have to admit, right from the starting gate, I'm not a native Michigander, so I haven't had the chance to explore all the Great Lakes. But I have been to the shores of Lake Michigan several times, and I have to say, having never been there before I did, I was absolutely sort of entranced by the white sands, the clear waters, aqua blue, Sleeping Bear Dunes, National Lakeshore. And because I worked for many, many years in Florida, I couldn't believe how much it reminded me of Florida and how surprised I was that was actually like what the shore of a Great Lake looked like. So I have to say I would choose that as my favorite for now.
Oh, that's great. I've heard people say that they're always surprised by how big the actual Great Lake itself is, whether it be Michigan, Huron, what have you. But it sounds like the shoreline itself is also reminiscent then too. Okay, very cool. I've been a native Michigander all my life. I grew up near Lake Huron, and that's the one that I've always liked the most. But unlike Lake Michigan, it's really rocky for the most part on our side. So I think part of the joy of Lake Huron is finding the sandy beach and then having that little secret spot for yourself. But yeah, a bit of an underrated maybe lake, but I think that makes me like it more. So that's great to hear. Sorry to all the Lake Superior and Lake Erie fans in Michigan, but obviously we're talking water pollution, and I mentioned the Great Lakes because in many ways for Michigan, it's really a defining point of our state. It's where a lot of our wildlife is at. It's where a lot of our economic growth and generations at. It's where we recreate. It's where we hang out, take vacations. It's where we get water from. Great Lakes are super important. But as we'll find out throughout the course of this podcast today, Michigan, the Great Lakes state, can't always properly protect its namesake from some of these pollutants that have been in our waters for decades or that we've recently found out about, etc. We're going to be diving a little bit deeper into the weeds on some policy issues. But before we do that, I thought it'd be nice to kind of center us or ground us in just the general sense of environmental protections in Michigan. According to Michigan rules, acts, laws, what are Michigan's duties for protecting our surface waters? Would you mind giving us a bit of an overview of that?
Sure. So today we'll focus mostly on the Natural Resources and Environmental Protection Act, which has an acronym that's pretty difficult to say, but it's usually referred to as NREPA. It has hundreds of parts. It was established in 1994 to protect the environment and the natural resources of the state. And there are different agencies that carry out different parts of NREPA. So part of it has to do with hunting and fishing. So those obligations would be carried out by the Department of Natural Resources. Some of the parts of the act have to do with regulation of chemicals and protection of surface waters. Those would be carried out by the Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and energy, which I always jumble those, but the acronym for that is EAGLE, which is a lot easier to remember.
Yeah.
So basically, there are many different parts of NARIPA, and assigned to carry out by different agencies, whatever makes sense within their purview. So for this particular part that we'll talk today, it's carried out by EAGLE. So, they're given the duty to protect the surface and groundwaters of the state through what we call Part 31 of NARIPA. And like I said, it has hundreds of different parts. Part 31 is only a piece of it.
Yeah. But before our podcast, I copied the full length of Part 31 within NARIPA and then pasted it into a Word doc so I could get the word count of just that one single part within hundreds.
Right.
And it was 22,000 words long. So quite the substantial list of environmental protections.
Yeah, exactly. And so within Part 31, there are multiple different parts that cover different things. So water quality standards, wastewater discharge permits, land application of biosolids. So these are all different parts within Part 31 that have sort of regulations and things, lay out sort of a guidebook of what do we need to follow in order to protect the state's natural resources.
Gotcha. And so the main focus of our podcast episode today is going to be on a single phrase ostensibly within Part 31 that was added about 20 or so years ago.
Right.
So across those 22,000 words, a single phrase that kind of changed the scope or the abilities of EAGLE, our state environmental department, in how it can protect us from pollution. We're going to be spending, a bulk of our talk today getting into the details of that. Could you maybe just generally explain what that addition was and how it came about?
Sure. So, like you said, almost 2 decades ago now, there were sort of some behind the scenes things happening. At the time, I believe that there was increased funding needed in order for EAGLE to fulfill its duties for issuing permits related to pollution discharge. So there were some fees that needed to be increased in order for the department to fulfill its obligations. And the ability to do that was granted by the legislature, but in doing that, they also said, we'll give you this, but we also are going to put a clause into the Part 31 Act that says EAGLE cannot promulgate any additional rules past a certain date, which was December 31st, 2006. So it was something that happened as part of an agreement, but now we're sort of locked into time. And the idea behind something like NARIPA is that you need people that work in science, that are experts in their field, able to update certain things and, use the knowledge that we have, which of course is constantly evolving, to best protect, not only waters, but public health. And locking us into time and saying, well, no matter what we learn, we're unable to update this any farther, has led us into a situation where now we're decades behind where we should be in adequately protecting the waters of our state.
And so just to to recap what you had said, NARIPA, big environmental law, within one part of it, Part 31, gives us a lot of protections around waters.
Yes.
Additional wordage was added that limited us from updating parts of NARIPA, parts of Part 31 after 2006.
Correct.
So in many ways, a lot of our water pollution protections are 20 years behind the game.
Right.
Got it. And I know that you and your our coworker Reese, put together a little 2-pager around some of the biggest kind of issues or some of these case studies as to how that little phrase that was incorporated in the early 2000s has kind of changed things since. I'd love to maybe pull out those same things today and talk about some examples so we can give people a sense of just how far-reaching Part 31 really is, and thereby how damaging that one little addition has been.
Right.
And I thought we'd first start out with spills, because when I think of pollution, that's the first thing that comes to mind for me, something like a big drastic event where a lot of chemicals or a lot of pollutants is spilled into the water. I know that under Part 31, thanks to your two-pager, that we have that Eagle is able to set some rules around how chemicals can be stored, how to monitor them, how to like follow up if a spill happens, things like that. Could you talk a little bit about those and how this change to Part 31 has altered those abilities?
Yeah, so that's a really good description, and I'll just elaborate a little bit more. There's a list that's maintained of chemicals that are particularly problematic. Maybe they're explosive, corrosive, dangerous in some way, and any chemical or substance that falls within that table that's within Part 31 needs to have special requirements that are followed by whoever is housing, storing, or containing that chemical or substance in any way. And as things we've learned a lot in the past 20 years, and I think 20 years ago, I don't think anyone was talking about PFAS or PFOA or chemicals within that set of chemicals that we have now identified as being basically I will say very limited in the way that they break down in the environment. So they are just long lasting, and they are chemicals of concern, certainly. But because Eagle lacks this rulemaking ability under Part 31, they're unable to go add liquids or any substance containing PFAS or PFOA to that list of things that require special storage. So the idea behind this particular rule is to make sure that anyone that's housing those chemicals are storing them properly, making sure that there's surveillance in the storage area that would alert someone if there was a spill, maintaining a plan to prevent a spill from happening in the first place, and just general common sense things that make sense for when we're talking about preventing a spill that could be very problematic. So currently there are facilities in the state of Michigan where it would be Eagle would like to say you need to follow these particular rules because of this chemical that you're housing, but because they can't go back into Part 31 and add those substances containing PFAS or PFOA, they are unable to mandate that this particular operation be required to follow the rules that they would wish them to require to lessen the possibility of a spill.
Got it. And so if a company was, say, storing PFOA, the most Eagle could do then would be like encouragement essentially, exactly. Or like asking to voluntarily do these things.
Right. Yeah. So reaching out, maybe proactively saying this would be the ideal way that you store and house this, but the company would be under no obligation to follow those guidelines because it's not official.
Yeah. Got it. And I know there's far more than spills. I know a lot of pollutants enter into our waters a bit more slowly, or they accumulate over time. Could you talk a little bit about bioaccumulative chemicals as well and how those fit into this picture?
Sure. So those would be things like they're very famous examples of what we consider bioaccumulative. So those would be things like mercury and PCBs, which we know are out there in the environment. And when they are released into the environment, they're sort of absorbed by aquatic organisms and have a way of concentrating in tissues. And then as you go sort of up the food chain, when a bigger fish eats a smaller fish, that bigger fish is going to have a higher concentration of whatever chemical we may be talking about. That's called bioaccumulation. So it's accumulating more and more as you go up the food chain, and that's why there are certain warnings for fish living in habitats as far as human consumption. So there are places where there are warnings for people either not to consume the fish, or for pregnant women not to consume the fish, or if you do consume the fish, a very limited quantity depending on the concentrations and what's been observed. And so again, this is something that sounds rather mundane, right? It's just a matter of Eagle keeping a list, like they keep a list of the polluting materials under Part 5, and they would like to include PFAS and PFOA. Here, this is another list. So, we would think that the experts in the state, right, like working to protect public health and toxicologists and people that specialize in following research, identifying chemicals of concern, we should be relying on their expertise to update what we would consider bioaccumulative.
Mm-hmm.
But we are unable to, or Eagle, I should say, is unable to update the list of what we consider bioaccumulative, again, because they can't do something as simple as adding to a list.
Yeah.
Because of that section that was added in the legislation. So, things like that where, this is where it really crosses into public health, right? Like people should be looking to Eagle to say, what are the chemicals I should be most concerned about? And having, the top agency that's in charge of protecting our state waters unable to add what's considered a bioaccumulative chemical is very problematic from a public health perspective.
Yeah. And you brought up a point that really stuck with me there too, is in that in other parts of this broad NERIPA, this broad environmental act, there are places where these chemicals are already listed, and we can't bring those over into this one specific piece around some of our surface waters. I think that brings up maybe a bit of the absurdity of this situation at hand pretty well. As we build on the absurdity, there's going to be, we'll discuss in a little bit about how some of our own federal regulations don't line up with our own state rules. But before we do that, we're going to take a quick break, Megan, and our listeners to hear a word from our sponsor, CalSec. So stay tuned. The Common Groundwater podcast is brought to you by CalSec, an international company headquartered in Kalamazoo that provides expertly crafted ingredients that help food and beverages look better, taste better, and last longer, all naturally. CalSec has set aggressive goals to send zero waste to landfills by 2030 and to create net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. You can learn more at calsec.com. Welcome back, folks, to Common Groundwater. You're listening to the first episode of our mini-series, The Polluter Rulebook, where we're going over water pollution issues in Michigan and how some of them have been exacerbated or have come about because of some limitations within some of the acts of Michigan's government. I'm here with Megan Tinsley, Water Policy Director at the Environmental Council. Megan, when we left off, we were talking about some of the examples of ways that one of our water protection acts, Part 31, has been limited due to some changes made by the Michigan legislature and the executive branch 20 years ago, and how they've kind of stuck with us ever since. I'd like to maybe pivot us to like a different sort of issue at hand within this change in act, and talk about how in some cases Michigan's, or the state of Michigan's government is at odds with some of the pollution standards that our own federal government has enacted. Could you give us some examples of kind of how this sort of tension is played out because of this rule change?
Yeah, so, as I mentioned, there are many different parts within Part 31. So imagine Part 31 is already this small part of this big, Natural Resource Environmental Protection Act. And then we've got Part 31 that deals with water. Within that, several other smaller parts. So there's one of those particular smaller parts that deals with industrial pretreatment, which is basically a set of steps that any industrial user of water kind of follows before what they're discharging is sent to the downstream wastewater treatment plants. So sometimes those things can be, the chemicals or whatever they're discharging can be particularly dangerous, maybe to the workers at the wastewater treatment plants, or corrosive to the machinery of the wastewater treatment plants. So there's this pre-treatment process that happens in order to lessen some of those risks. So that's something that sort of there's a federal component to, and the EPA, sets guidelines for this pre-treatment. And, over the past 2 decades, those criteria have been updated. But again, it's another example where Michigan hasn't been able to follow suit and adopt the sort of federal set of regulations because we're kind of locked in this, no new rules past 2006.
Mm-hmm.
So actually the process that the EPA sort of adopted was just a little bit more streamlined and straightforward, still with the goal, end goal of being protective of the downstream wastewater treatment plants in the environment. But it's just one more place where we can't come into compliance or, with the way things are kind of now industry standard, so to speak, where Michigan is still using an outdated process because we haven't been able to update the rules around industrial pretreatment.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would say another place where EPA has actually sort of developed standards that would be helpful to Michigan would be in numeric surface water criteria. So, across the state, we have a lot of problems with algae blooms. Like they could be on the Great Lakes. We certainly know about, the Lake Erie, the problems there with the bloom that every year NOAA issues a forecast for the projected severity and duration of the bloom. I mean, it's like clockwork. It's going to happen. And then, of course, our inland lakes are also seeing lots of algae blooms where, beaches may be closed for swimming. And the EPA has set numeric criteria for two of the nutrients that are known to fuel those blooms, nitrogen and phosphorus. So having those criteria would sort of provide a better set of standards for, Michigan waters. So we would have levels that we would attain not to exceed in nitrogen and phosphorus, knowing that those levels above certain thresholds, you are likely to see the occurrence of algae blooms. But again, we have the EPA sort of criteria that's already been established. Michigan wouldn't need to do that research or work, could simply adopt those standards, but again, would be unable to because they are not able to adopt or promulgate new rules.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So those are two examples that I can think of.
Yeah, and it really is a shame because, again, we're the Great Lakes state, and I feel like when you're a state that is surrounded by water and made up of a lot of water and has an environmental department, you have a lot of scientists who are always studying this and know have the best practices, so to speak, or know what's best for our waters. And the fact that we can't even upgrade them to the EPA's more, nationwide sort of guidances is really unfortunate there.
Right, and as you pointed out from the beginning, we're the Great Lakes state. This is our primary environmental tool within the state to protect our waters. And here we are unable to use that tool because it's been limited.
Yeah. Another point of the absurd nature of it all. And I know we've thrown out a lot of examples to our audience, but I do want to give one more that I think really brings out that absurdity in some points. At least to me it does, which is around beach closures and how in some cases we can't even upgrade some technology, not only the science, but also the technology to help us protect wildlife and people from polluted waters. Could you talk a little bit about that situation too?
Yeah, and this one ties into what I said. A couple of the other examples are really kind of just updating things that you would think of kind of mundane, right? Like we need to update what we consider this type of chemical. We need to classify this type of chemical as, falling under this part so that we're giving the right protections to, prevent spills. This reminds me of this because again, technology, science, we've increased our learning, and health departments use certain tests to make the decision on whether they close a beach or not. So let's say there was a rainfall event, we had sewage overflows, or we're in an area where there's a lot of septic tank use, and it's summer season and people are at their lake homes, and we need to test the waters to see if they're safe for swimming. So E. coli can pop up from either of those, and there are testing things that health departments can be using, specific tests that deliver quicker results. And it's just a matter of the methodology that's being used. A better test was developed. They could be issuing beach closure decisions in a matter of hours, but instead within Eagle's rules that are currently in place, they're sort of what they're explaining or what they're utilizing is testing methodology that requires a longer time span. So it might not be until the next day that the health department would have those results and officially close the beach. So again, just being able to recognize, hey, there's a better test that exists. We could be more proactive in protecting public health, shutting down beaches when we're, closer to when we realize there's a problem, rather than having this time lag for test results to come in. It's just another example where simply having the ability to update their rules would allow that more updated technology to be recognized.
Yeah. I gotta imagine some Eagle scientists and staff have to be chomping at the bit in some ways.
I think there's a long list of backlog things that they would like to take care of.
Yeah, just simple routine almost things, yeah. I guess this kind of unintentionally with that comment, but this kind of leads us to some solutions at hand here. So as broad and as expansive as Part 31 is, and as that change to Part 31 that caused so much trouble, the solution itself seems pretty simple. We just need to take the red pen and we need to strike that extra wordage that was added in the 2000s. Is that correct with my thinking there?
Yes, it's a very, and we have two pieces of legislation, a House version and a Senate version that does exactly that. It just strikes the problematic language that was added that said there could be no more rules promulgated past that date in 2006. So it is a very short piece of legislation, very straightforward, and just gets rid of that addition that's so problematic.
And I know that there's a lot of environmental groups around the state kind of coalescing around this issue. Do you feel like there's good movement? Where the bill's at right now? Could you give us just a little bit of a lay of the land in terms of like the advocacy side of things?
Yeah, sure. So the bill is actually moved out of the Senate Energy and Environment Committee. So it heard testimony. There was a vote. It moved through that committee. We're working now on encouraging a vote on the Senate floor. We did have a hearing on the House side as well. And are just waiting a final committee vote, and then ultimately, hopefully, movement to the House floor as well.
Okay.
So we have, good movement, but we're trying to, put a strong push in to get us past the finish line.
Gotcha. That's great. And for folks listening, as we go through these podcast episodes, as you potentially look at other sorts of media or of content we're putting out there, we'll keep you updated on where things stand throughout this course too. As we're going along through this legislative process, are there any ways that organizations can kind of take part in this effort or learn a bit more of the technical side of things?
I think that we can share the 2-pager that we developed that sort of outlines all of the examples that we went through, and anytime anyone's willing to reach out to their particular senator or House member, that's really helpful to show support for this legislation. And the bill numbers are House Bill 5205 and Senate Bill 663.
Great. And I'll be sure to add those bills and the bill numbers and the 2-pager into our description of the podcast as well, so folks can easily access that. So as you kind of mentioned, the solution, it seems so simple in many ways. Once, like if and when, I'm going to say when, this legislation passes and we're able to bring back Part 31 to its original state, so to speak, are there any other things that you're looking for ahead as that kind of goes into effect?
That's a good question. So this is really critical. I mean, for the state's water resources, this is a very critical step for us to take. And I would say beyond that, if and when, let's say when, we are able to restore this rulemaking ability, it's important to remember too that we need to maintain adequate staffing and budget for the departments in charge of carrying out these parts of NERIPA. Because having rules is one thing, and that's very important as we've gone through, but we also have to have a capacity for those rules to be enforced and for monitoring to occur, so that we know that still, even with the rule, they're being followed and we're adequately providing protection. It's like a maintenance. It's like taking care of your car. All of the nuts and bolts are important, but we need the continued care and maintenance too, to make sure, because we have a backlog right now of things that we need to do, and things that need to be addressed that haven't been able to for so long. we'll also need continued investment to make sure that once we get, some rules in place that haven't been able to be developed for some time, that the end result is ultimately improved resource protection.
That's great. That's great. As a comms person, love the metaphor. Love the connection there to cars. Thank you so much, Megan, for taking some time to talk to all of us here in the audience and to myself today. Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And to those in the audience, again, we'll have some helpful links for you in the description of this podcast. And stay tuned for some future episodes where we'll talk to some folks about some other broader ways in which our government has sometimes struggled to properly protect from pollution because of some other sorts of politic and policy in place right now. So stay tuned for that in the weeks ahead. Thanks for listening, and thank you to our sponsor, Kelsec, for supporting the Common Ground Water podcast. We'll see you soon.